This is the Thoughtful Travel Podcast. I'm your host, Amanda Kendall of the notaballerina.com travel blog. Every episode I'll share travel tales from several fellow travel lovers, and together we hope to entertain and inspire you, remind you of some of your own great travel experiences, and encourage you to hit the road again soon. Hello and welcome to episode 49 of the Thoughtful Travel Podcast, which is all about understanding history through travel. As I often say, I think we learn so many different things from travelling, and sometimes they're more tangible things like history. I think travelling through a place and understanding its history from a kind of feet on the ground perspective gives you a completely different idea from just reading a history textbook in school or even just watching a film. Taking myself as an example, so when I was in year 10 in high school here, I was lucky enough to spend a month in Germany on a school trip. And it was 1990, so the year before the Berlin Wall had come down, and I happened to be super lucky and be staying with a host family in Berlin in October 1990 on the very night that West and East Germany were reunified. And my host family took me to the Brandenburg Gate in the middle of Berlin for midnight when the fireworks all exploded and it was time for Germany to be one again. So obviously that was a very, very meaningful way to kind of live history. And, fast forward a year and I was back in school studying through year 11 and 12. That's the last 2 years of high school here in Australia. And I studied history as one of the subjects I'd chosen. And fortunately enough, in that study of history, there was a lot of World War II history and even 20th century Germany history. And I have to say, I don't think it's a coincidence that I was the top student in the class, because I think having been there and experienced parts of that history and visited museums across Germany and, just being where those historical events had happened, I think obviously it made me much more interested in it, but it, gave me such a different perspective, especially from somewhere as far away as Australia, where our history is really quite a different thing. So I think travelling can really help you understand history in a completely different way. And my guests today seem to agree with me. So my first guest today is Zoë Dawes of The Quirky Traveller. You might remember I got to meet Zoë in person last year when she came out to Perth as part of a British bloggers group. And I got to tour parts of Perth and WA with her. But I did miss out on a wonderful historical tour of Fremantle, our port city, which she mentions in our chat today.
When I was young, my dad really liked history, and he used to take us to the stately homes of England, the big houses like Blenheim Palace, Woburn Abbey, and places like that. And he would talk about the paintings, and he was interested in kind of military history a bit, but also he was interested in the kings and queens of England. So I'm pretty sure I sort of absorbed quite a lot of his interest when I was younger. And I remember I wanted to do history. It was O-levels in those days, and you had to choose when you were like 14 years old. And I wanted to do history until I saw the syllabus, and it was all sort of to do with Victorian repeal of corn laws and goodness knows what. And yeah, quite. I kind of wanted to find out more about naughty King Charles II and things like that.
Yes, that would be way more interesting.
Yeah. So when I travel, I'm always fascinated by the culture and the history of the place. And whereas I know a lot of people, I do like art and I do very much enjoy that, but I love visiting like how big houses, not big or small, where people lived in the past to sort of try and see what they lived like. And I can remember in Amsterdam a couple of years ago, I went to actually go to the Tulip Festival at Keukenhof, I think it's called.
Oh, yes, yes. I've been there. That's so beautiful.
It's amazing, isn't it? Oh,
incredible.
And they do beautiful artworks, don't they? Out of the tulips they make.
Yes, it is. It is like an art display. Exactly. It's incredible.
Beautiful. And I had like a half a day to myself, and I went to visit a couple of houses, of the merchants' houses along the canals, and that was just so interesting, because obviously Amsterdam is very closely linked with the artists Vermeer and people like that. And to see the places that the people who commissioned the artwork lived in, but then also, I don't know, somewhere like Anne Frank's, that's sort of complete opposite, but again, part of its history. So I really love that aspect of it. I know it's not appears terribly cool, or some people aren't. It doesn't turn them on, but that's okay.
We all have different interests. It's quite okay.
Absolutely, and I think it's something that when I'm traveling, whenever anybody says, what would you like to see, I will say, I'd like to eat some local food. I'd like to meet a local person who can tell me a bit of the story. And I'd like to visit a place that sort of represents your past as well as your present or future. And in Fremantle, do you know Rusty, the guide that took us around?
I have done tours with Rusty before. He's amazing.
Isn't he great? And
yes.
He did the Fremantle tour, because again, I love that, with finding out the history of Perth and Fremantle, which is so integral to Australia's history. And he did an evening tour for us, and it was a kind of combination of history and food, which is just perfect.
Oh, ideal.
Yeah. I mean,
he's an ex-butcher, I think, isn't he?
He absolutely.
Yeah.
So, he's just perfect because he's got a real in-depth knowledge of the history and culture of the area, but also really loves his food. And when we ended up, I think it's Little Creatures. It's a brewery bar restaurant. And there was a kind of very quirky art gallery upstairs with painted surfboards and lots of modern art. And it was like perfect because we'd gone through, 100 years of history through the town with its old buildings and everything. We'd learned about the food, the really vibrant foodie drink culture there is there. Yeah. And then we ended up in this place which celebrates both. Perfect. So that's a great example of history through the travel.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Oh, I know. I was so upset I couldn't join you that night because I knew it would be a good one.
Yeah, I know. It was you. You went back, didn't you? But yeah, you did miss a good one.
I did. Yes. No, I couldn't get enough babysitting to cover that and still get up to the northwest. So yeah. But I knew as soon as I saw Rusty's name on there, I thought, oh, that'll be a good one because I've only done Perth tours with him. I've never been down to Freo with him, and Freo is so fascinating. Fremantle really is a fascinating part of Perth, and I was just there on the weekend with my son, and we went to the Shipwreck Gallery as part of the museum there, and we had such a ball looking around at all the things they had discovered in European ships from a couple of centuries ago that had crashed while they were trying to discover Western Australia or trying to decide that it was an inhospitable place and they didn't want to settle here. A lot of people came looking down Western Australia's coast before eventually someone decided to stay. We're still pretty far away from the rest of the world, but that's the way we like it, I think. Anyway, Zoe also mentions in our chat the Anne Frank House in Amsterdam, and I wanted to point that out especially because that is my all-time favourite museum of all the world. And if you are going to Amsterdam ever, do make sure you reread Anne Frank's diary before you go and then go to Anne Frank House because, I don't know, it's just something that really struck me. It's a very well put together museum, but it's also a very meaningful one and I think, really relatable to lots and lots of people. So do check it out if you get to Amsterdam. Now, my next guest is Kate Forsyth, who we've met before and is a novelist, a prolific novelist with a lot of her work being historical fiction. So obviously she has a deep interest in history and travelled a lot to really understand that history.
I obviously am someone who has always loved history. I studied it at school. I've always read a lot of historical fiction and, of course, I write historical fiction. There is nothing I love more than going somewhere I've never been before and then discovering its secret history, its hidden history, the extraordinary things that have happened in this place, the extraordinary lives of people who have been born and lived and died in this spot. I find it endlessly inspiring for me as an author, of course, but also I find it endlessly inspiring for me just as a human, this idea of being connected to the past and being connected to the lives of people who have lived lived before us, and to understand, something of their struggles and their sufferings and their sacrifices, and also, their joys and their everyday pleasures. I think it reaffirms in me so much about what it is to be human and how important the individual life is.
Oh, that's marvellous. Have you got an example of a place you've visited where you really got a good sense of how people lived in the past?
I have travelled so much and been to so many amazing places, but I do have to say probably Venice. When you are in Venice, it is a living city, but it is also a city filled with ghosts. Everywhere you walk, you see how buildings have been built on top of other buildings, how stones have been taken from one building to patch a bridge. You can see the lives, of all of those that have lived in the past, being a living presence on the streets. Everywhere you go and everywhere you look, it's 1,000 years old, Venice. Such an old city. And unlike, let's say, London, you can still find traces of the medieval past in London, but it's not all around you. You have to actually, go deep into the alleys, and it's a very modern, contemporary, sophisticated city. Well, Venice has been guarded from the skyscraper, and so it gives you a great sense of what life must have been like.
Yes, you can really vividly imagine stepping back in time in a city like Venice, can't you?
Oh, just wonderful. It's one of my favourite cities in the world.
Yes, I was pleasantly surprised when I visited. I visited as a child and I don't remember it very well, but as an adult, I kind of went reluctantly thinking, oh, it's so touristy, but wasn't really looking forward to it. And then I realised you could just keep walking and keep turning corners and find all kinds of, sort of hidden joys. And it was, a really lovely place to just explore.
I think that's why I love it so much, is this idea that you can set off on foot and then you find yourself lost in this maze of little squares and alleys and bridges, and they say that you need to cross 3 bridges away from San Marco, and then you'll be in the real Venice. And so, I mean, I love San Marco, obviously, and I love all the palaces and the cathedrals. But there's a very great sense, because people still live there. It isn't like some cities that are only for tourists. It does have a real life of its own. But it depends what time of year you go with Venice as well. Like, you don't really want to go in August.
Yeah, I was there over Easter, so sort of April-ish, and it was a bit cool. The weather was quite cool, and it was, I was so impressed.
Early spring or late autumn or winter is when you want to be in Venice.
Yes, because I assume otherwise it's just massively crowded.
Yeah, that's right, and it's hot and stinky.
That doesn't sound good at all.
No.
Well, that's lucky I didn't go then, because then my suspicions would have been confirmed and I would have kept saying, oh no, terrible touristy place.
Most people who don't like Venice, it's because they were there in August.
Yeah. Good to know.
All right. For you.
Yes. Experiencing travel properly is all about inside information.
Isn't it just? But isn't it wonderful now that, we can travel to so many extraordinary places in the world, and we can prepare ourselves properly. We can do our research. I love researching a trip.
Oh, me too.
It's one of my favorite things to do in the world. Imagine where I'm going to go and what I'm going to pack, and it's so much fun.
Oh, it is endless fun. Yeah, and I love that it really kind of makes the whole experience so much longer and so much more. You can look forward to something for so long, and
exactly.
Yeah, I
and
love
then
that whole.
You have all the fun of remembering when you come back. It's a gift. Some giving.
This chat with Kate actually makes me want to return to Venice and get lost there a few more times and learn even more about its history. I think Kate really has got it all sorted out when it comes to travelling to really understand history, and if she's able to then impart that history within her novels, then it's really a history well learned. Fascinating stuff. Speaking of novels, my next guest is Sarah Ridout, another Aussie novelist, and she wrote a book set in modern times in France called Le Chateau, and I just read it over the past weekend, And when I had this conversation with Sarah, when we recorded this a few weeks back, I hadn't read it. And now, having listened to it again and having read her book, all of the history she talks about makes it just sort of sets it into place a whole lot better. So I do recommend her book thoroughly. It was a really fabulous read. And yeah, so let's listen to a bit more from my discussion with Sarah about all of the history she learnt while she lived in France.
My 8 years in France, I'd have to say I went to France. I knew basic things about the history of France, the revolution, all that kind of stuff. I didn't know French. I did schoolgirl German, which was very useful in France. I just living where we did, which was in the south near Montpellier. It's a very specific region that it's often been kind of the poor cousin really of France, and in history it's often was persecuted, and I learnt all this stuff about the history from living there and talking to friends and noticing street names, and things started to happen when I was there. I learnt about the Cathars and the Albigensian Crusade, which was basically when the Pope, for a period of time, I think it was 2 or 3 popes, was actually not in Italy, but they were in France. They were in Avignon.
Oh,
yeah,
I didn't know that.
There's a place in Avignon called the Palace de Paps, which is where the popes lived, is this big chateau place, Anyway, when they were in France, what they were trying to do was there was this big land grab coming from the north down to the south, and the Catholic Church got involved, and that was what the Albigensian Crusades were, really, was taking all the lands and the money from the Cathars, who were Christians, but they didn't worship in a church, and they didn't give huge donations of gold to the Catholic Church and all of that sort of thing. So it was very political.
Right.
Yeah, so they basically, it was the first genocide, modern genocide.
Oh,
and I actually mention it in my book. And I don't know if people have heard of Kate Moss, the author, not the model.
Yes.
But she's written books about the Albigensian Crusade. Set in Carcassonne, because that was one of the areas, and where I was about an hour away from Carcassonne, and so the whole area was very affected by this, and so it's always been it's an area that's got a bit of a chip on its shoulder because of all these things that have happened in the past. They kind of don't trust the government, and they don't, because of everything. They're French, but they have been persecuted, so terribly.
Yes.
And so it's sort of balanced with the Basque area, which is on the other side near the Atlantic.
Yeah, right.
So my area is on the Mediterranean, and the Basque area is on the Atlantic. So it's sort of like bordering with Spain there on the top side, and we're down with Spain, but near Girona. The Mediterranean.
Right. Yeah.
And so I really learnt about all of that stuff and all the things that happened, and, Béziers, which was about a 15-minute drive from my house, and where I used to go, it had all the nice dress shops, and, I used to go and get my hair cut there and stuff like that.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, but there was the cathedral there, and all the people took refuge in the cathedral during the Crusades.
Oh, right.
And their guy, I can't remember his name now off the top of my head, he gave the order to burn everyone in the church.
Oh, right.
Yeah, and said,
Nice.
it's fine. God will know who believes,
Oh,
and just being immersed in that history, sitting outside that cathedral that still exists, and having a coffee in the morning before you go and have your hair cut. It's just you're totally immersed in this stuff all the time.
Yeah, amazing.
And that maybe, knowing that history, I really wanted to refer to it in the book.
Yes, because so interesting, and yeah.
It is so interesting, and I think just the layers of history in a place so old, it's fascinating. And also to me, I did see, as an Australian, I did see parallels with the Aboriginal people, and
right, yes.
And it really struck me, how the victor writes history basically, doesn't it?
Of course, yes, yeah. Oh, that's a really interesting parallel, and yeah, something that you wouldn't discover ordinarily, perhaps.
No,
but yeah, by traveling and being somewhere, it's something that can strike you.
That's right, and the fact, France is the most popular country really in the world. Like, I think, how many people? Like 70 million people go there every year for holidays.
Yes, it's such people are so fascinated by it. Yeah, and everyone wants to go. Yeah,
everyone wants to go, and it's just, I think you don't really. I mean, modern tourism and stuff. I think it's become more complicated, and I think you can do tours and you can do really specific things, like very historical things if you wanted to, but just if you were just going to a place and you wanted to see Paris and you wanted to see a few other cities and do a couple of things in 2 weeks, you wouldn't necessarily touch on all of these layers of history.
No, for sure, that's right.
Yeah, and I think before you go on trips, I think it's good to read books set in the place that you can visit, because it gives you a better understanding. And also, I wouldn't necessarily say just travel books, but just novels set in that. Yeah,
absolutely.
It's another insight, and it prolongs the trip too, and you get more out of it, I think.
Oh, absolutely. I always love to do that, and I try to avoid reading too many travel books as such, because I don't want to know all the boring details, but to read novels that have been set in a place I find fascinating. Like I went to Iceland the year before last and read Burial Rites before I went, and it gave me another completely different perspective. I think Sarah and I share a lot of the same perspective, perhaps growing up in Australia, where the history of our country isn't sort of documented by the physical monuments or buildings the way it is in a place like Europe. Then it's really fascinating to live in Europe and to live within its history, to do an average, ordinary thing like go and get your hair cut, but be within kind of this historical context. I mean, here in Perth, we barely have any old buildings at all. Like if you find a building that's 100 years old, that's extraordinarily rare. So, I think I felt the same as Sarah describes, when I was living in Germany and in Slovakia, just being immersed within that historical context is, a really fascinating thing. And I also completely agree with this discussion about reading, especially novels set in a place before you travel there. I mentioned Burial Rites, which was set in a historical novel set in Iceland, and I just loved reading it before I went to Iceland. I'll leave a link in the show notes to that novel. And if you have some other fantastic novels to recommend set in particular places, I would so love to hear about them. Hop over to the Facebook group for Thoughtful Travellers. Just search for Thoughtful Travellers in Facebook, or look for a link in the show notes and request to join there. I would love to hear some more recommendations wherever it is in the world that you would like to travel or you have travelled, and some novels that you've read set in those places. I think it's such a great way to prepare for a trip and do a bit of armchair travel while you're at it. So in any case, that pretty much wraps up my episode today for episode 49 of the Thoughtful Travel podcast about understanding history through travel. Please do hop over and join the Thoughtful Travellers Facebook group, or get in touch on Twitter. You can tweet me at Amanda Kendall and use the hashtag ThoughtfulTravelPod. You will find all of this information and show notes and other links I'm about to tell you about at notaballerina.com/49, because this, of course, is the 49th episode. And do head over there and you'll be able to find lots and lots of useful links, especially today. I seem to have lots of great stuff to refer you to. So first of all, a big thank you to Zoe from The Quirky Traveller. She's at thequirkytraveller.com, and you can find her on Twitter or Instagram at Quirky Traveller as well. And as the name would suggest, she travels the world and finds lots of really interesting things there. So with a historical bent often. So if you are interested in learning more about history through travel, do check out Zoe's website, etc. After Zoe, I spoke with Kate Forsyth, and you can find her at kateforsyth.com.au. And in the show notes, I'll leave some links to some of her more recent novels set in various spots around the world. Bitter Greens, The Wild Girl, and The Beast's Garden will be on the list for you to check out. And finally, I also got to chat with Sarah Ridout, and you can find her at sarahridout.com.au. And having just finished it, and in fact lent it to my mother, who messaged me last night to say she'd finished it in less than 2 days and loved it too. I heartily recommend reading Le Chateau. I'm not even a particular Francophile. Like, France is not one of the places I'm particularly fascinated by, but I just loved reading Le Chateau. So I've got some links in the show notes to that as well, along with a link to Burial Rites, that great novel set in Iceland. So happy reading with all of those. This has been another episode of the Thoughtful Travel Podcast. Show notes and other information are at notaballerina.com/podcast. Join me again soon for another chat about why we travel. Bye for now.
Jackrabbit FM. For your ears.
Who is that? Hi, podcast.